Hi, and welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly, Change the Message on It, with me, your host, Eden Bokrazian. In today's discussion, we'll be talking about Western foreign policy, the conflict in Gaza, and wars all around the world. We're absolutely delighted to have with us Brendan O'Neill, editor of online magazine Spiked and columnist for The Telegraph and The Big Issue. Brendan, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the thing I've been thinking about over the past couple of months is why there has been so much anger and fury with Israel, why there have been so many protests across Europe, why people have been out on the street shouting and screaming and burning the Israeli flag. And lots of people say, well, the answer is quite obvious, because Israel is bombing Gaza, it's killing Palestinian children, it's harming Palestinian civilians, that's why we're angry. But I don't really buy that, because there are lots of other wars going on at the moment which people are not angry about. Two good examples in my mind are, firstly, the war in Ukraine. That's a war in Europe, in the continent in which we live, where around 1,500 civilians have been killed, so not very far from the number who've been killed in Gaza, including old women, young children. A maternity hospital had to move underground because it was being bombed, so women are being given birth in cellars inside Ukraine. So I'm very struck by the fact that lots of people simply don't know what is happening in Ukraine, never mind are they protesting about it on the streets. And then the second good example is that we've just had the first anniversary of the massacres in Egypt, which is where the El-Sisi dictatorial regime massacred around 1,500 people last August. We've just had the first anniversary of that. And I don't remember any protests against Egypt over the past year. In fact, lots of human rights groups and left-wing activists and others have been very quiet about those massacres. And the reason I raise those two acts of war as being particularly interesting for me is because they are both, in different ways, supported by our governments. Our governments support the government in Ukraine, which is doing a lot of the bombing in the east of the country and which is killing a lot of civilians. And our government support the regime in Egypt, which is massacring civilians. And in one day last August, the regime in Egypt massacred about 1,100 civilians in one day. And that's nearly as many as Israel has killed in Gaza over the period of 6 weeks. So I'm very interested to know why people have latched on to Israel. And I think there are two problems with the way they've latched on to Israel. The first is that it's not really an anti-war sentiment, because if you look at what they're saying about Israel, they're saying that the West needs to intervene. They're saying that the International Criminal Court needs to judge Israel and pass judgment on it. They're saying that the United Nations needs to go in there and cohere Palestinian borders and protect Palestinians. Some are even saying that NATO needs to bomb Israel in order to keep it in place. So I think a lot of that fury on the streets of London and Paris and Berlin is actually pro-war rather than anti-war. It's actually rehabilitating the right of the West to judge this foreign part of the world and to say what should happen there. So I see it as a very pro-war sentiment rather than an anti-war sentiment. And then the second problem is I think Israel has just become an entity through which people can let off steam, through which they can express their anger about evil or about corrupt people controlling the world, or about this kind of horrible, rotten country called Israel, which is apparently causing all the instability and conflict in the world. And I think that's a very backward sentiment, because people are really pushing aside any kind of proper political analysis of the Middle East in favour of turning Israel into this kind of typical form of evil which is destroying everything around it and which is having a rotten impact on the world. So the way I see it is that there is nothing positive whatsoever about anti-Israel sentiment. Firstly, because I think it's very pro-intervention, pro-war, and secondly, because I think it's driven by a desire amongst people to get their moral rocks off rather than a desire to understand that very complex part of the world.
I just wanted to ask you, how do you think then we should address the Israel-Palestine issue, or should we address it at all?
I think we should address it, but I think we need to spend more time thinking about what's really happening there. And in particular, thinking about how much has changed there over the past 20 or 30 years. Lots of people will say the problem with Israel is that it's supported by the West arms it, the West gives it money, the West basically cajoles it into bombing Palestinians and others. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think the relationship between the West and Israel has changed enormously over the past 20 to 30 years. The West is now much less favourable about Israel, is more hostile towards it, calls into question its right to launch wars and to even its right to exist in some cases. So I think we need to, yes, we should address this conflict because it's a pretty serious conflict, but I think on the one hand we need to have more serious analysis of the dynamics behind it and how much has changed in that part of the world. And secondly, we also need not to blow it out of proportion. This is a conflict between two groups of people. The way in which it's been transformed into a culture war, where you're either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, and everyone around the world defines themselves in relation to this conflict, particularly young Muslims, particularly lots of people in the West, that's really problematic because it's blowing it out of proportion.
I do believe that the protests against Israel, those who are protesting, are coming from really different and diverse backgrounds, and I think it would be wrong to classify them, see them as a monolithic behemoth. And although they are protesting about Gaza, I think they in themselves have very different opinions, and not necessarily all of them are anti-Semitic, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think they're all anti-Semitic by any stretch of the imagination, although I think lots of anti-Semites have latched onto these protests to express their prejudices. You've seen that in Berlin and Paris and even in London, where, you know, horrible signs have been stuck onto synagogue doors and so on. So I don't think they're all anti-Semitic, but I do think they are all a bit misguided in the sense that they are focusing too much on one conflict. They are not seriously analysing what's happening there, and they're using it as a way of letting off steam. And I think that's a common trend today, where people use issues like this to let off steam. They look for something that they think is evil, and then they kind of scream and rage against it. You know, it was, for a period of time, it was Rupert Murdoch, you know, the cause of all evil in the world, corrupting politics, corrupting people's minds. Then it became the bankers, you know, those evil bankers causing the recession, making us all really poor. And now it's Israel, you know, this, which is seen as the kind of source of all the instability in the world. So it's that kind of desperate search for one thing. And I think that has been a common trend across all the protests that I've seen or that I've read about or that I've been on, which is that they rage against Israel in a very disproportionate, unusual and quite prejudiced way. And they often, as I said earlier, they call for the West to get involved there to sort Israel out. That to me is the most problematic trend, because it's actually giving authority to the group in the world which is most responsible for conflict, which are the Western powers, the so-called international community. If you give moral authority to them, you're actually unleashing more conflict, because they are the true causes of most of the conflicts that we see happening around the world today.
It's almost as if people have forgotten how much their intervention in the past has caused major havoc. I mean, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. How do you propose we tackle this dependency on the West to always get involved in other global affairs?
Do you believe that the media creates that feeling of anti-Semitism amongst the public in the West?
Brendan, do you think that by referring to the conflict as a minor conflict and by using people's lack of knowledge about other conflicts, do you think that that's almost trivialising the dangers that the Palestinians face?
I just wanted to know what you thought about the emotional aspects of this conflict, because, you know, it's bringing up so much. It's quite distressing to see people that would normally be quite liberal. It is bringing out anti-Semitism, and it is bringing out Islamophobia as well. I just wanted to know what you felt about the emotional aspect of this conflict.
Western intervention, especially in the last 20 years, Brendan, you kind of spoke about that in one of your articles, for example, of agreements like the Oslo Agreement, and later in 2003, this idea that, for example, Palestinians and Israel can't live as one state. And I think we should definitely look into how Western intervention through a peace process within the last 20 years exacerbated the problem and actually led to a lot of Palestinians to suffer not only politically but also economically. Because I know you mentioned how Palestinians, for example, that used to work in that Israel side, are no longer able to do since the 2003 process and agreement that was made and supervised by the West.
Haven't we sort of got a responsibility to not intervene, but we still have a responsibility to be involved somehow? Because if we've created these problems, then we can't just walk away and be like, oh, we've created these problems, but us being involved is still going to be a problem.
I think the problem in the Middle East is unquestionably that the West has done too much, not that it's done too little. And it's involved in every single aspect of this conflict. The only Western involvement we tend to hear about is America's support of Israel, which is to the tune of $3 billion a year, which involves arming Israel and so on. But there are many other forms of Western intervention in the Middle East. America also funds the Palestinian Authority, which runs the West Bank. And if Gaza joins with the West Bank in a kind of joint government, which is the plan, then America will also be funding effectively Gaza and effectively Hamas. So America funds both sides of the conflict as it happens. The UN is deeply involved in Palestinian territories. There are numerous Western NGOs swarming through the Palestinian territories. And the United Nations effectively runs Palestine through its Palestinian Refugee Institution, which funds every aspect of Palestinian life, which funds their welfare state, their education system, which provides people with jobs. It's like a feudalistic racket going on where you have these Western institutions that basically look after every single aspect of Palestinian people's lives, and I think that's very damaging. So the West is embroiled in every single facet of this conflict, and the reason I think that's problematic is because it means that there is no incentive to either side to sort this thing out, because they are constantly being pulled to and fro by various external forces who have no long-term interest in peace in that region because they aren't based there and they don't live there. One impact I think it has is it's really detrimental to Palestinians. And that's one of the key things. I mean, we've talked about the anti-Semitism, and I think you're right to raise the question about the media's responsibility there. And I think there is a link between the way in which the media and politicians talk about Israel as this kind of uniquely problematic state, and the way in which that can kind of generate a view of Jewish people as a uniquely problematic people, because of course Israel is a Jewish state, so in some people's minds those things become blurred. But as well as giving rise to anti-Semitism, the current discussion is also really infantilizing Palestinians, and it turns them into the kind of global victims who we can all coo over and feel sorry for and post photographs on Facebook and, you know, wear the Palestinian scarf to show how trendy and right on we are. And they become everyone's victim, everyone's favourite victim. It really makes them live in a kind of political limbo. Palestinians are still subjugated these days. They don't have their national rights or their democratic rights. But it's not so much Israel that's doing that. It's groups like the United Nations, it's groups like Western NGOs, it's Western campaigners themselves who treat the Palestinians as so victimised and infantile and childlike that they have to be looked after by us for the rest of time. So there's a really contradictorily colonial dynamic behind the pro-Palestinian campaign. It's about us needing to look after these poor children, and that's why the damaged, injured Palestinian child is the symbol of Palestine. You know, this is the poor little victimized child that we adults in the West need to look after. So I would say that the way in which the conflict has become this really disproportionate focus for so many in the West is damaging to Israel because it's delegitimizing that state which the West said could set itself up 50 years ago. You know, the West gave a green light to the setting up of Israel and now is kind of withdrawing its consent, which I think is a really dodgy thing to do to a group of people who've lived somewhere for 50 odd years. But it's also damaging to the Palestinians because it treats them as perennial children for the rest of time. So both sides lose out from this constant Western intervention, and I think we need to argue, in my mind, for less Western involvement, less Western interference, and let's allow the adults in that region to fix their problems themselves.
To put a positive spin on it, what can happen now? What active steps can people take to kind of transform the image on both sides? So to transform the image of Palestine as a victim, but also to transform the image of Israel as the attacker or the bad person.
If we intervene too much, a lot of havoc is caused, but then in the same way, if we were to leave both parties to try and resolve everything themselves, there's still, I think, going to be a prolonged sort of period of disruption until some sort of amicable resolution can be brought.
Just on intervention, I think one thing that's quite interesting that you have written about is the kind of changing motivation of Western powers. So in the past, it was much more about, you know, clear geopolitical interests. Now it's almost like a blind reaction to events. Does that mean that we're in much more dangerous territory than the old days when it was much more predictable about where things were going?
Israel has undergone over several changes in its status, and first it was Herzl who proposed the idea of a state of Israel, a Zionist state, which was met very positively by pro-Zionists, but very negatively by the colonial powers at the time. And then was Goran who actually made the state possible, and the Zionist movement that surrounded it, which was also met with a lot of flack by the surrounding countries. And now we have Benjamin Netanyahu, who's got all these expectations weighing on him to secure Israel finally and make it a viable state, recognizable state by both Gaza and by the surrounding countries. And I'm wondering what is permissible for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, to do to secure Israel.
Israel obviously has all the weaponry, they have all the aircrafts. So when it comes to conflict, you will definitely see that Israel has an advantage, and right now that's the case, where Palestinian casualties are far higher than Israel. So I'm just trying to get your view on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Lots of people talk about the disproportionate nature of the war, where lots and lots of Palestinian civilians have been killed and only a handful of Israeli civilians have been killed, and around 50 or so Israeli soldiers. But, I just think about the war in Iraq. I don't remember people necessarily raising that point in relation to the war in Iraq, which killed tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians, and no British civilians died as a result of that war. No American civilians died as a result of that war. American and British soldiers did, but no civilians did. And I don't remember that a same kind of argument being made about the ridiculously disproportionate nature of that war. So I'm always really struck by the fact that it's said in relation to Israel far more than it is said in relation to other recent conflicts, which have been entirely disproportionate in a similar way. I think in relation to the question about Zionism, I think there's something slightly missing there, which is the reason why Zionism came to be seen as popular amongst Jews in Europe, in particular in the 20th century, which is because of the Holocaust and because of what Europe did to the Jews. Because in the early 20th century in Europe, there were actually lots of different political strands amongst Jews. Some of them were revolutionary communists and wanted to overthrow capitalism and just live in Europe in a socialistic republic. Some were assimilationists. They wanted to join with capitalist society and make loads of money and be rich and be normal. And then some were Zionists. And the reason the Zionists came to the fore and became the predominant force is because of the Holocaust, because Jews thought to themselves, well, we can't live in Europe because we're being exterminated. And there's actual government policies which say that if you are a Jew or the son of a Jew or the grandson of a Jew, you will be exterminated. So it's Europe's fault that Zionism became this kind of popular creed amongst Jewish groups in the 20th century, and then they felt the need to create their own homeland. What I see happening now is that because anti-Semitism is rising in Europe again, it's given more credence to Zionism. So we've heard Netanyahu say openly to European countries, if you can't look after your Jewish populations, if you can't protect their synagogues from vandalism, then we will take them and we will look after them. So that's one of the most striking things about Zionism, both in its 20th century version and its modern version, is that it's a problem created by Europe and Europe's inability to treat Jewish people as normal people. So the issue with Zionism, the fact that it's still a live political trend, is because of Europe and what Europe has historically done and what it's doing to Jewish people today. I think Niall's point about geopolitics is a really important one, because I think it's the recklessness of modern Western intervention which creates a lot of these problems in the first place. And, you're absolutely right. In the past, the West would have had a clearer sense of why it was intervening in the Middle East or North Africa or other parts of the world. It would have actively tried to cultivate political movements, create states, sometimes by drawing a line in the sand, creating governments to govern those states. And now the West does the opposite of that. It just goes around destroying states, pushing aside governments, and then going back home again and saying, we won. So it's the opposite in many ways. They've gone from being imperialists who created governments to rule on their behalf to being these kind of crazy individuals who go around the world wiping aside governments and then leaving nothing in their wake. And that's one of the reasons why Israel is under such pressure at the moment, because the war in Iraq really had the unwitting consequence of boosting Iran. because the Middle East was always often balanced between Iraq on one side and Iran on the other side. What happens when you take Iraq out of the picture? Iran becomes more powerful because its old balancing block is gone. So Iran has become more powerful, Iran supports Hamas, Iran supports Hezbollah, and Israel feels more under threat. So I think a lot of the problem in Israel now is precisely a consequence of the Iraq war. But I think the craziness of modern geopolitics can really be seen in Iraq and Syria at the moment, where Western intervention has helped to sweep aside old government institutions, old state structures. And what do you have? You have crazy, violent Islamic groups moving into that vacuum. And I would say that the rise of ISIS, which now controls vast swathes of Syria and vast swathes of Iraq, is not a coincidence. It's a direct consequence of the fact that the West weakened the state institutions in those countries and left nothing behind. And so you have these groups moving in there, getting American weaponry, getting the stuff that the West left behind, and you now have the increasingly surreal situation where America is bombing its own weapons that are in the hands of ISIS. So America is effectively bombing its own materials. That is the crazy situation we have in the Middle East at the moment.
I think the problem of rising extremism in the Middle East is also a Generation Y problem on top of the Western interventionism problem, because I read that many people from Europe, including Turkey, thousands and thousands and young people are joining ISIS, for example. And I think this might also have to do with the fact that all these 20-something or early 30s people have been experiencing the global crisis, and they are mainly suffered from unemployment and prolonged periods of poverty. And I believe that they are much more likely to join to organizations like ISIS once they experience such things. And seeing that there are so many people aligning with this idea of extremism, I think it is a truly postmodern and global problem that is also contributed with the rise of communication networks.
Now that the video of the beheading has come out, allegedly the member of ISIS was British. We don't, there's not been any confirmation on that. But wanted to know how you felt about how our failings in Iraq are going to affect our domestic decisions and how we intervene, basically intervening in on ourselves and young people joining from Britain.
What impact do you feel that would have on Islamophobia and how wider society views Muslims?
I feel that the media is drawing a lot of attention on jihadists and how they're going to Iraq and Syria, but I think not enough attention, not any attention at all is given to Western fundamentalism. I think Western fundamentalism is a lot of the root of the issue behind Islamic extremism. I feel that a lot of people going to these countries maybe feel that they don't have an identity in Britain, and maybe that Islamic identity is not valued as highly as it would be somewhere else.
There's been ongoing discussions about what it means to be British. It seems like everyone is disorientated and not quite sure what it means and what they should defend, what values, and I think that's the real problem.
I'm not sure if I would totally agree, but I think disengagement in general is definitely one of the reasons behind it. In the same way that some people might join a protest, I think it stems from the same kind of disengagement and anger and like search for answers. Joining a protest and becoming an extremist is kind of disagreeing with the way things are, but not sort of having an appropriate outlet or an appropriate forum to sort of discuss these ideas and to come to, like, I guess what we would see as reasonable conclusions. So they feel they have to look elsewhere.
I agree, because a lot of people assume Britain to be multicultural, but you've heard David Cameron yourself saying that questioning has multiculturalism failed. So I think people need to establish what does it mean to be British, and we need to accept everybody's cultures.
I disagree with you completely. I think the problem is actually multiculturalism and this emphasis on difference rather than a common vision and a common way of living. That is actually the real issue for me.
I can disagree. I don't see why we can't have a common way of living and still embrace differences, because everyone comes from different backgrounds and different environments. I don't feel that they have to reject that or in a way push that aside in order to be considered British or have British values? Why can't part of British values be diversity?
In the absence of old-style British values, you know, Victorian values or whatever they were, that nobody really believes in anymore, the government and policymakers have latched onto difference. And it's empty. What does it mean? You know, and actually emphasises our differences. So we're, you know, Muslims are addressed as the Muslim community, there's a gay community, there's this community, and actually fits people into boxes all the time. And there's really nothing that Britain doesn't really know what it stands for. And so you can see there's this kind of simple idea that for young Muslims who are almost told to obsess about their identity, that they see everything through the prism of Islam. Let people get on with their differences. It's absolutely fine. That's something that's wonderful about Britain, that it's got over most other countries in the world. But that's our own private, individual things.
I'm not convinced by the idea that it's because these people have experienced poverty or the recession, that's why they're going over there and joining ISIS. Because in fact, the guy who's currently under investigation for the beheading video, the supposedly British guy, one of them comes from a £1 million house in Maida Vale, had a very comfortable upbringing. And from what we know of the other Brits who have gone out, they haven't been down at heel, they haven't been particularly poor. Some of them have come from middle-class families, or they've been university educated. And in fact, a study was done of Al-Qaeda a few years ago, looking at 400 of Al-Qaeda's most influential members, and they were all middle-class, they were all university educated. Most strikingly, a lot of them became radicalised in Europe, whether they were born here and they became radicalised here, or when they came from the Middle East, and it was while they were in Europe at universities or studying, that's where they tended to become radicalised. So the trend of these kind of extremists, particularly the leaders, is that they come from pretty well-off middle-class backgrounds, and I find that very interesting, because what I think is happening is there's two problems here. The first is a problem in the West, and then the second is a problem in what the West does to other parts of the world. The problem in the West is that people feel they have no connection to mainstream society. They feel alienated from it. And they are encouraged to look upon themselves as victims. And, you know, I don't buy the idea, actually, that Islamophobia is a widespread problem today. I just don't buy that. But I think the way in which young Muslims are encouraged to believe that everyone hates them and everyone is prejudiced against them and everyone is out to get them, that is actually what inflames a lot of this sentiment of people who go and join ISIS. And if you listen to what this beheading guy says in the video, it's full of self-pity and the idea that he's a victim. And he says things like, you've attacked our women, our children, you're always doing us down. It's the politics of victimhood being played out in a foreign land. So I think a lot of the problem of the obsession with Islamophobia, the encouragement of communities to see themselves as victims, is really now being transported into foreign fields. And ISIS is fueled by a victim mentality, by the idea that you've oppressed us for so long and now we're going to fight back in this really kind of victim-orientated way. And then the second problem is the fact that Western intervention creates the space in which these groups can emerge. So you have a dual problem. You have a problem of people in the West feeling like encouraged to see themselves as victims, encouraged to pity themselves all day long, encouraged to think the world is out to get me, whether it's the bankers or the Jews or whoever. And then, on top of that, the West has created a space in the Middle East in which they can go and play out those fantasies, in which they can take up their knives and their guns and their rockets and actually make real their own sense of victimhood. So I think it's a dual problem of a loss of cohesion here in our Western societies, and then a destruction of state structures in the Middle East. You put those two things together and you get an explosive group like ISIS.
So do you think bringing up anti-Semitism now will enable Jews to see themselves as victims as well?
I think there's a difference between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and the difference is this. Everyone wants to talk about Islamophobia all day long. It's all you ever hear about. It's in the press, politicians talk about it, people make statements on it, people go on about it endlessly. No one wants to talk about anti-Semitism. It's the shameful prejudice. Left-wing radicals, who are usually quite anti-racist and progressive, haven't said much about it. Politicians don't really know what to say about it. Lots of people are actually apologising for it by saying it's a kind of misguided response to the conflict in the Middle East. There's a real difference here, and it's really worth teasing that out, which is the question of why you have this kind of Islamophobia industry. You know, I was in a toilet in a pub recently, and there was a poster on the wall which said, "Are you a Muslim? Have you suffered abuse? Has anyone ever said anything bad to you? If so, phone this number." So they're actively trawling for evidence of Islamophobia. But in relation to anti-Semitism, the response has been much more muted. People don't want to talk about it. So I think the Islamophobia thing is now part of the multiculturalism industry. It's about making people feel like they are victims, that society is out to get them. And that fuels this quite backward political outlook. The problem of anti-Semitism, which I think is a worse problem than Islamophobia at the moment in Europe, is that no one wants to talk about it or get to grips with it or try to explain what its origins are and what can be done about it.
Brendan, do you think, from what you said about radicalisation, I find a lot of Muslim young men, they seem to be radicalised online. And even though their parents, they come from a wealthy background, when they come to the UK to study, they still inherit their culture from their parents. So when they find that the Western world has intervened in their homeland, do you think that they still want to do their part for their home country, in a sense? Is that why they join ISIS?
But see, a lot of these people who join ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they're not actually going to fight in their homelands. You know, some of them are of Pakistani origin and they go and fight in Afghanistan, or some of them are from Indonesia and they go and fight in Iraq and Syria. So it's not a homeland thing. I think it's much more, it's driven by, they want an outlet for a quite juvenile political sentiment. And the juvenile political sentiment is, we are victims, everyone hates us, we really want to make a statement about that. And they do that through Al-Qaeda and through ISIS. I think it is the politics of victimhood with knives, that's what it is, you know, with kind of guns and knives on top of the usual moaning that these kind of groups of people do. And I think it's a really destructive sentiment, but I don't think we can blame their parents, because actually lots of the first generation immigrants who came to Britain were very keen to assimilate into Britain. They wanted to be part of this country, they wanted to have jobs and to be part of mainstream society. It's only later amongst the second and third generations that you have people suddenly putting on the veil and wearing traditional Muslim dress. And I think that is a problem of multiculturalism, because they've been educated to see themselves as different. Whereas their parents, when they came to Britain, were educated to see themselves as the same, as equal. So the shift from universalism to multiculturalism has encouraged people to revert back into an identity, to sink back into their identity. And that gives rise, and identity politics is a very dangerous, destructive form of politics. And in my mind, ISIS is the most extreme form of identity politics.
ISIS has effectively demolished the border between Syria and Iraq after the US troops pulled out back in 2013, and now they are trying to form a new caliphate in Iraq and Syria. And my question is, the United States did not want to support at first the Kurds who wanted to break off and form an independent Kurdistan off of Iraq, and if they do support them, it will take a long time to form that state for them to actually fight a proxy state against ISIS. And on the other side, they have to either help or fight Assad, or if they support Assad, they will effectively support Iran, who have actually called against the destruction of Israel, and they are Holocaust deniers. So my question is, who do the United States and the West support, or if not support any of these three, should there be a fourth option for them to explore other than airstrikes or anything military?
With the problem that's going on in ISIS, do you feel as though there's an alternative to not intervening?
I think we have to just appreciate the extent to which the West is responsible for the rise of ISIS, the extent to which Western intervention is responsible for this. You know, firstly, in Iraq, they take away the state that had governed Iraq for a long period of time, the Saddam Hussein state. And then the thing that people like me and others predicted happens straight away, which is that Iraq falls apart, its various different ethnic and religious groups start to get into conflict, the groups that had been kind of cohered under this state for a long period of time. So it gives rise to this kind of antagonism and conflict and civil clashes in the country. And then the West also intervened in Syria as well. I mean, lots of people think the West failed to intervene in Syria, which is just not true. The West went in there, it funded certain rebel groups, not ISIS but other ones. It encouraged them to set up new government structures in parts of the country that Assad had fled. And ISIS, the rise of ISIS in Syria has been in those parts of Syria, the parts of Syria in which the West created new governmental structures. So ISIS hasn't actually won 30% of Syria or 40% of Syria, whatever it is at the moment. They haven't actually won that by taking on Assad. who is quite mighty in comparison to ISIS. They've done it actually by sweeping aside all these kind of flimsy groups that were set up by Western funding and Western arms and Western money. So ISIS moved into a vacuum created by the West in Syria, and it has really benefited from the vacuum created after the destruction of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. And it is those two dynamics that allowed it to rise, allowed it to gain more weapons, allowed it to gain money, allowed it to gain territory. So I think we have to be really careful before we say the West needs to go in there and fix it, and we need to realise the role that Western intervention played in creating ISIS as a problem. I think, is there a solution? Well, if there is, it's not an easy one, and there is going to be a lot of conflict and a lot of bloodshed before any of this is resolved, and we have to accept that. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what will be the easiest route, the route with the least amount of conflict or the least amount of bloodshed? And in my view, it's for the West to stop intervening in that part of the world and allow the groups there to resolve it. It will be violent and it will be bloody. But, for example, I'm entirely in favour of the Kurds taking on ISIS. I think the Kurds are the only group pretty much in Iraq who have handled themselves with any dignity over the past few years. They actually believe in what they fight for, therefore they have a vested interest in seeing off the threat from ISIS. I think we need to stop the Western demonisation of Assad. Even though I'm opposed to Assad, I think we need to encourage the West to stop doing that, because that inflames ISIS, that inflames other rebel groups. So I think we need to call for less Western interference and allow groups there to sort this problem out for themselves. And I think if we were to do that, there are a sufficient number of groups in that part of the world who could pretty well take on ISIS, which is not huge. It's scary, but it's not huge. And I think they could do a pretty good job of really defeating it.
I would like to know what your thoughts were on the Ukraine, Brendan. I don't actually think that the West have intervened aggressively in the Ukraine situation. I don't think they've challenged Putin enough. In fact, I think the situation has actually made Western leaders such as Barack Obama look fairly weak.
On thoughts of Ukraine, I think maybe Western foreign policy has fallen back onto old times, and there's sort of a weird nostalgia for Cold War sympathies. They just allow the public to carry on with this view that Putin is a dictator.
Following on from that, I disagree with you. I think the West depiction of Putin is really, really problematic, and it's forcing him and Russia on the defensive, and it seems completely self-destructive. The West has, over the last 20 years since the end of the Cold War, has completely encroached on Russia's neighbouring territories and is right on their doorstep, and it's quite understandable that Putin and Russia feels kind of threatened by the West. I think they've got plenty of reason to, depicting him as simply evil and the cause of the problem. And it's ridiculous to blame Putin and Russia for the problem when it was EU and Western interference that really inflamed what was a little political squabble between particular groups in the Ukraine, forcing the issue by supporting and going in and encouraging groups and effectively exploding a civil war. And then they blame Putin for everything.
I think the problem in Ukraine has largely been caused by the West. That's the way I see it. And I think, but it's a complicated problem, because I think you're right on one hand that the West hasn't behaved very confidently in Ukraine, and it's kind of just enforced sanctions against Russia, and it's kind of going through the motions. But so it kind of has exposed the West's weakness and its lack of desire to get physically involved in another conflict. But at the same time, the West bears a great deal of responsibility for the war there, because, as Niall says, it really exacerbated the protests that were taking place in Kiev, and it intervened on the side of the protesters. It gave them political and moral legitimacy, and it effectively encouraged them to set up a new government. And that's what gave rise to the civil war. That's what meant that the leader of the nation as he was ousted, was thrown aside, and a new government was set up, basically hand-picked by Western politicians. And that really exacerbated a very tense, divided country, and really brought to the fore all these tensions that have long existed between West and East Ukraine. So I think the West bears a great deal of responsibility for that. But then, of course, its response to this mess that it creates tends to be quite a cowardly one. So it is pretty hands-off, a few sanctions here, a few sanctions there, not really wanting to get involved in any meaningful way. So it exposes the dual problem of Western intervention today, which on the one hand, it has this itch to intervene everywhere in the world and to kind of throw its weight around in a very reckless way. But on the other hand, it doesn't want to commit troops, it doesn't want to launch a war, it doesn't want to have any boots on the ground, especially post-Iraq. It doesn't really want to do anything too heavy. So that's the real problem we face today, is trying to explain why Western intervention takes that form, why it's a kind of what we on Spite have called cowardly colonialism, or kind of weak imperialism. And I think it's that dynamic that we can see all around the world today, that dynamic of a Western intervention which is driven, I don't think it's driven by strategy or morals, I think it's driven by moralism, a kind of shallow moralism, a desire, a knee-jerk desire to prove that you are good by pushing aside evil dictators or evil regimes. It's very childlike and infantile. And the consequence is that you leave these gaping vacuums around the world. There's one in Libya, there's one in Iraq, there's one in half of Syria. Really tense parts of the world where you create these kind of political and moral vacuums, and that is extremely dangerous. And I think that's the trend we're seeing with Western intervention now, the sweeping aside of governments it doesn't like, the creation of these stateless territories around the world into which various groups are moving. And just to come back to what we talked about at the beginning, the reason I'm really worried about the anti-Israel movement is because I think it's related to this, because I think the anti-Israel movement is pro-Western intervention. It wants the West to go into the Middle East more. It wants the International Criminal Court, which I think is a tool of the West. It wants to use that court to punish Israel and to help the Palestinians. It wants all these Western institutions to bombard the Middle East and other parts of the world even more. So I think that's where we have this real problem at the moment, is that we have an anti-war movement. We have a movement that presents itself as anti-war, but in fact is part of the pro-Western intervention problem. So even when you are faced with protesters who are burning Israeli flags and who are saying they feel sorry for Palestinians, I think you really have to tease out what they're demanding. And as far as I can see, this is a movement that is demanding more Western intervention. And in my mind, Western intervention is the cause of all the problems we've been talking about today.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'd really like to thank Brendan O'Neill and our volunteers for an excellent discussion. If you'd like to take part in the next discussion, email us.